The question of whether there is something behind the line has been plaguing people for a long time, and there is nothing surprising about it, because you don't want to believe that there is nothing more after death. After this story that happened to me a few years ago, I am sure that there is something after death, that there is someone waiting for us behind the line. Let me tell you this mystical story, and you decide for yourself whether I'm right or not. So, this story happened a few years ago. I had a grandfather who had been through a lot in his life, but the time had come for him to die. All his life he was suffering from ulcer, and one day he was diagnosed with stomach cancer. As you know, with this diagnosis do not live long, and even more if you are over 80 years old. But my grandfather was a strong man. In his time he had gone through the horrors of German captivity, several times escaped from a concentration camp. He was caught and severely beaten, even tried to execute once, but he miraculously survived. And even after the terrible diagnosis, grandfather decided to fight the disease, and he even managed for a while. The doctor said that he should not live more than a month, but he managed to survive in this world more than 4. The last weeks he was in terrible pain, but he endured this terrible pain, and morphine asked to inject only when it was absolutely unbearable. My grandfather lived in the neighboring district with me and my grandmother. We all took care of him, and of course, but most of the time my mother, his daughter, spent with him. When she came, grandfather was usually lying in bed watching TV or reading a book. He had a huge library. If anyone remembers, before it was fashionable to keep a bookcase at home, so grandfather had a few such cabinets. But lately, when my mother came to grandfather, he just lay on his back and slept or half slept. His stomach was swollen and looked like it was about to burst. We had been waiting for Grandpa to be gone for days, but he stubbornly clung to life. When we came to tell his story, he would talk and even joke with us. But once we came to grandfather, we saw that he was lying on his back, as usual. His face was covered with a towel for some reason, and it was impossible to understand if he was alive or not. His abdomen was so swollen that no breath was visible. We thought we were too late, and grandfather had left without saying goodbye to us, but it turned out that we were wrong. When we entered the room, grandfather said, "I'm still alive." Someone came to see me and said I still had 3 days left. These words sent shivers down my spine, but the worst thing happened later. I was in session at the university at the time, and at the moment my grandfather died, my mother was with him. She told me how he spent his last few minutes. The scariest part, that he was fully conscious. In the morning he ate breakfast with an appetite that he hadn't had in days, said he was leaving today. At night they came to him again and reminded him that it was the last day. He himself changed into all clean clothes and lay down on the bed, saying he was leaving soon. A few hours later he was gone. He died quietly on his favorite couch. When I arrived at my grandfather's house, he was still warm. My father and I put him on the table and called an ambulance. The most amazing thing was that it had really been 3 days since we had last talked to him. Mom stayed that night in my grandfather's apartment. There was a candle by the dead man, and she sat looking at the candle, and suddenly in the flame of the candle she saw the figure of my grandfather walking away somewhere along the bright corridor, turned around for a moment and went on. My mother said that at that moment she could clearly see in that candlelight that my grandfather was young and cheerful again. After the funeral we all gathered in the apartment where Grandpa lived, sat at the table. It was the height of spring, the sun was shining, and it was a very bright day. The door to the balcony was open, and as we all sat down to eat, a huge bumblebee flew in through the window. It made a circle over everyone sitting at the table and flew back out into the street. Grandma said it was Grandpa coming to say goodbye. Believe it or not, but since then, the day my grandfather died, a bumblebee flew to our house, made a couple of circles around the room, and flew back out into the street. Maybe its grandfather comes to visit us. It's been more than 10 years since my grandfather's death, but since that moment I realized that life doesn't end after death and I'm no longer afraid of death. I know that our most faithful and beloved people are waiting for us there, so there's nothing wrong with it. What do you think?